interpreter. I am not assigned as interpreter yet.
Okay. Is there a possibility for Edna to take it on first and then we assign you?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Edna, are you on now?
Yes, she is.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. As I was saying, I'm going to introduce now Masri Fuladi, our new executive director, who's going to give some brief remarks and talk about the power up and his time with us. So please join me in welcoming Masri to the team through the chat box or with emoji reactions. Take it away.
Thanks, Beatrice. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Masri Fuladi. I'm really glad for such great turnout today. And I just wanted to introduce myself so that you all have a better sense of who I am. And I would love and encourage you to reach out to me after this call. Would love to get to know you all a little bit better. So a little bit about myself. I'm an Iranian immigrant. My family and I moved here at the tail end of the Iran-Iraq war, and really I got involved in the immigrants' rights space post 9/11. I'm a Muslim. My mom wears the hijab, and after 9/11, unfortunately, our family was the target of a hate crime. Was fairly young, high school, driving to school with my little siblings in the back, and there's about 4 individuals who jumped out of a truck, started banging on our windows and telling us to go back home. Both my younger siblings were born in the United States, and so the time as a green card holder, I just remember the shock that my parents felt and my family of being second-class citizens and not really having the ability to feel empowered. And that's really what got me jump-started in this space. I've been doing policy organizing and legal work for most of my professional career. Had the opportunity to go to law school and work at a legal service organization for about a decade. Working very closely with organizations like CIPC, Cherla, Caressa, and so many other folks up and down the state. And really what brought me to CIPC was the organization's ethos of listening to diverse voices and engaging in pro-immigrant advocacy. I'm really excited to establish a community-driven statewide immigrant agenda. And I think that's essentially what we're trying to do here with Power Up. And so want to encourage you all to continue to engage with us in the coming weeks and months as we try to ensure that we amplify the voices of immigrants throughout the state and make sure that in addition to continuing the legacy of the work at CIPC to represent undocumented individual, whether they're seeking access to health, food, a safety net, continuing to battle the detention and deportation processes that unfortunately are impacting our community, try to reimagine what the immigrant community is going to need for the next 25 years. And your voices are going to be incredibly important to that. And the last thing I'll mention before turning it over to Sarah from our team to tell you all a little bit more about the Power Up process is we know there's a diversity of issues impacting the immigrant community, and we want to make sure that that diversity is well represented in the budget advocacy and policy work that we do. And one of the ways that you all can do that is by becoming members of CIPC. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't heard about our membership program and are interested in a specific issue area that is mentioned today, whether it's housing, economic empowerment, workforce development, whatever that may be, if you represent a particular part of the state or a particular demographic within the immigrant community, or you might not even be fully in the immigrant space, but serve members that are the membership model and the process that we have allows us to further amplify your community's voices in the work that we do. So AJ from our team is going to drop some information in the chat around that model. Please go ahead and take a look at it. I'll put my information there as well. Feel free to reach out, and I'm really looking forward to working with you all in the coming weeks and months. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Dar from our team.
Thank you, Masi. We are so excited to have Masi on the team, and glad that he could come and introduce himself to you all directly today. And looking forward to more opportunities for you all to get to know our new executive director at CIPC as he fully integrates into the work that we're doing and our partnerships with all of you. So before I begin, so I'm Sarah Dar, and I'm the policy director at CIPC. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm based in Los Angeles. Before I begin, I want to quickly thank the California Community Foundation and the Weingart Foundation for their support in making our Power Up Regional Dialogue series and this webinar today possible. Now, I'll take a few minutes to share some background about where the information that you're about to take in actually came from. Historically, over the years, CIPC has, on mostly an annual basis, COVID kind of threw things off, but on a mostly annual basis, we've held policy dialogues, which are simply listening sessions with immigrant communities, community-based organizations, and advocates that serve immigrants and other stakeholders who are deeply invested in immigrant rights across California. And in the past, often these policy dialogues have been centered around particular topics or issues that impact immigrants, and usually they've been regionally based. And the purpose of these conversations has always been for CIPC to continue maintaining an authentic and up-to-date understanding of the most pressing challenges that immigrants, and in particular low-income immigrants in California face, and their ideas for how to best address those challenges. So for CIPC, this knowledge informs our state-level legislative and budget and policy advocacy agenda. However, last year, we decided to do things a little differently. We recognized that what we learned from these conversations is very informative for us, but it's potentially deeply informative for various other audiences besides just the CIPC staff, other advocates, immigrant serving organizations, elected and government leaders, philanthropy. The findings can inform all of our work, whether that work is policy change, as in CIPC's case, or direct services, or civic and community engagement, or policy making, or grant making, or academic research. I mean, you name it. There are many, many reasons why knowing what's happening on the ground among California's immigrant communities could be useful to different stakeholders. So this year we sought out the opportunity to partner with USC's Equity Research Institute, or ERI, to actually use qualitative research methods to organize, analyze, and share out the findings from our regional dialogues with all of you, in hopes that it might be useful, relevant, and informative for your work. A bit about ERI, for those of you who are not familiar with them, the USC Dornsife Equity Research Institute produces data-driven analysis and rigorous research, leads convenings, engages strategic collaborations, and models effective, sustainable, racially just research to power social change. So I hope that helped to define what our objective was in doing this work. And now I will hand it over to Shannon Camacho with ERI. And a note before she begins, while Shannon is presenting, please put your questions in the chat. Her colleague, Kia Duncan, as well as members of the CIPC team, will try to respond to clarifying questions directly in the chat. And we will also compile unanswered questions to try to address as many of them as we can after the presentation during the Q&A. So thank you so much. And Shannon, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Like Sarah said, my name is Shannon, and I work with USC ERI as a data analyst. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us for this report back webinar today. So I'll be presenting on our findings from the 4 regional dialogues that we attended and listened to. I do want to give a huge shout out to Kia Duncan and Joanna Lee from ERI for helping all throughout the data collection process, as well as the analysis. So thank you both for all of your great work. So as you can see on the slide, the 4 regions where we held the dialogues were the Central Coast, the Central Valley, and Los Angeles and San Diego. One quick thing, can folks hear me all right? Can you give me just a thumbs up?
I hear you, Shannon.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. All right, so moving on. So basically all of these dialogues were very informative and gave us a lot of rich information about the people living there. We learned a lot from the community organizations that attended these dialogues, as well as the leaders from these different regions. So to give you a bit of a timeline of the Power Up work, we began our work with the first dialogue in the Central Valley in November 2022. And that same December, we visited San Diego. And in March of this year, we held a virtual dialogue for organizations in Los Angeles. And our final dialogue took place in the Central Coast in April. So prior to these convenings, both CIPC and ERI created an agenda to plan out the questions that we wanted to pose to folks. So during each dialogue, we gave a short presentation on some of the key demographic data points on immigrants for the state of California as a whole, as well as the specific regions that we were visiting. Participants in the regional dialogue were organizations and representatives from the region, so they were able to provide us with really important on-the-ground data about their communities that may have not been reflected or highlighted through traditional forms of data, such as the US Census. So CIPC organized the agenda to dig at the key issues participants were most concerned with, things such as housing, healthcare, immigration enforcement, etc. Participants were also able to engage in large group discussions regarding their policy priorities, as well as smaller breakout sessions that were focused on specific next steps and potential opportunities for advocacy moving forward. So now moving on to the methodology that we used to capture these learnings from the dialogues. So as a research institute, our main role in the Power Up work was conducting the analysis of the data that we collected from the 4 regions. It was important for us to really utilize a standardized system to analyze the data so that we can create a clear and discernible process from initial data collection to analysis to the presentation of the findings, which is here. So the conversations that we captured in various ways served as our data. We were able to capture these conversations from the dialogue in the forms of worksheets that folks were asked to fill out, general notes, and breakout group post-its. The worksheet created by us at USC ERI allowed participants to write down their policy priorities, questions, what they consider to be opportunities and challenges, as well as the systems in which they felt needed to be invested in or divested from. So notes were taken at each dialogue by ERI and CIPC staff, and every large group and small group discussion had a note taker to capture participants' contribution to the discussion. Additionally, post-it notes were used to capture participants' thoughts on key questions such as the region's most pressing issues, as well as potential policy solutions to those issues. And so everything that folks shared at the convenings was collected physically and electronically scanned onto a drive. These conversations became our data set, and we organized this data through our analysis software Deduce in order to help us summarize the major themes from the dialogues. So to share a little bit more information about our analysis, we took all the conversations, our data that folks had, and we organized these comments and conversations by a list of topics and subtopics. So for example, anytime somebody brought up the issue of affordable housing or expensive rent, we put that under the category of housing. We organized these comments into topics so that we could identify how many times people mention certain topics such as housing. And this really gave us a sense of what folks' priorities were at the convenings. So although utilizing data from the 4 regions of California obviously doesn't paint a picture of the entire state as a whole, but we were still able to gain a really good understanding of which issues were most common for dialogue participants in their organization. And we were also able to learn about the patterns that existed throughout the 4 regions. So now into the key part of the presentation, the findings. But first, I did want to give a huge thank you to all of our Power Up Dialogue participants that we heard from throughout the 4 regions. Some of you may be on the call today. We just want to thank you once again for taking the time to participate in our regional dialogue. And we really appreciate all of your invaluable work as well as your insights. All right. So the following findings are derived from our analysis, and we have created visualizations in the forms of charts and graphs to better highlight the key takeaways from the dialogues. So we really believe that these findings are going to be very useful to gain a better understanding of these regions' policy priorities. And we believe that this can also be a tool for advocacy strategy moving forward. All right, so our first finding. Our first finding is around the diversity of immigrant communities across the regions. And California, as we know, has a very large and vibrant community of immigrants. And so throughout all of these dialogues, folks brought up this diversity and especially uplifted specific immigrant communities that are often overlooked. So some of the particular communities that were mentioned during the dialogue are, but of course are not limited to, asylum seekers, incarcerated or formerly incarcerated immigrants, LGBTQ+ immigrants, Indigenous communities, Black immigrants, Asian American Pacific Islander immigrants, and Muslim immigrants. And of course, we all know that these communities and identities are intersectional, and there are people that are able to hold on to multiple characteristics all at once. And so dialogue participants had many conversations regarding these immigrant communities and their various and unique needs. So obviously this finding doesn't mean that these groups are the only ones that folks talked about. It just so happened that at the dialogues, these happen to be some of the most commonly mentioned communities. So to better contextualize this finding, we have some quotes on the slide. So I'm going to read them out. People are being told to present themselves to Border Patrol and they go straight into the deportation machine and accrue debt because of all of these processes. And this came from a Central Coast dialogue participant. So this really highlights the disparities that incarcerated or formerly incarcerated immigrants face in this country. The next one being immediate amnesty, entry to all immigrants, asylees, refugees who arrive to the US from a nation destabilized by any US intervention. Meet basic needs for all, without criminal carve-outs or immigration status, housing, healthcare, education. And this came from a participant in Los Angeles. So this person really highlighted the need for policy solutions in the form of amnesty for all immigrants and really highlighting the need for social services to avoid discriminating based on past criminal convictions. And then the last quote being, all the hate and racism that's going on. Recently, increased attacks on communities of color and marginalized communities, such as the LGBTQ communities, deadly, violent. There's a safety concern there that's ever present but heightened. And this was from a San Diego participant. So this quote really stresses the reality that LGBTQ+ immigrants experience elevated levels of hate and discrimination, and that safety needs to be a priority when it comes to policymaking. So our next set of findings are going to focus on some of the key issue areas that folks brought up during the dialogues. And these findings are going to capture some of the most pressing issues, common themes, as well as policy priorities from participants and their communities. All right, so this is our first chart, priority issues overall from the dialogues. So this shows what kinds of topics the folks from the 4 regions brought up most often. So throughout all of the dialogues, some of the most frequently mentioned issue areas were housing, economic inequality and disparities, and immigration. Of all the topics, housing was the most frequently mentioned at 24%, as you can see. Economic inequality and disparities, as well as immigration, were also major topics that folks honed in on during the dialogues. And for example, under the topic of economic inequalities, folks brought up things such as wages, workforce protections, employment, etc. It's also very important to highlight that throughout all of these conversations on all of these issue areas, folks really lifted up our immigrant communities who are incarcerated and those who are refugees and asylum seekers. Because these are communities that face constant policing, fear of deportation, and exclusion from social services. And later, I'll do a deeper dive into some of these issue areas in order to highlight the specific concerns that participants discussed. But for now, we're going to take a look at some quotes and comments that people gave on the next slide regarding these issues. So as you can see, the first quote is, housing is a human right, access to housing for all. So throughout the dialogues, multiple participants really stressed the importance of changing the narrative around housing for it to be one of a human right rather than something that all people are not guaranteed. The next quote, undocumented folks don't receive benefits. Mixed status families with children who are citizens are able to apply for benefits using their children's information. We need statewide policies around benefits specifically for all undocumented folks. And this came from a Central Valley participant. So this quote is especially important in highlighting the fact that many social services, both from the state and federal government, exclude undocumented immigrants from receiving those benefits. And since the struggle for affordable housing and accessing quality healthcare, et cetera, affects the state as a whole, undocumented immigrants should have the same social services and benefits as people with status. The last quote being focused on ending the practice of detention centers and removing ICE from our communities, working towards Freedom City. And so this participant from the Central Valley offered the policy solution of reducing immigration enforcement and detention and encouraging local governments to create policies to protect immigrants instead of continuing to police them. So as we can see, some of the common threads around all of these issues are the fact that folks are calling for advocacy to make these things such as housing more acceptable for folks and for undocumented immigrants to be safe from enforcement. The following findings will dive deeper into this issue to show what folks specifically were discussing regarding some of these things such as housing. All right, but first, this slide shows the top 2 issue areas that were discussed during each of the 4 dialogues. So folks obviously discussed a host of different issues, and these just happen to be some of the ones that floated to the top. This finding definitely shows the importance of housing, as it was the main issue for 3 of the 4 dialogues. And it shows us that housing definitely is a statewide issue. The Central Valley and the Central Coast really highlighted the issues of language access and economic inequalities, which is very relevant considering the discussions we had of the region's indigenous immigrant farm worker population and the low wages that these kinds of workers make. And next, we're going to look at what folks specifically discussed regarding some of these common issue areas. All right. So starting with housing, dialogue participants brought up topics such as affordable housing, rent burden, and development. Some of the other sub-issues were homelessness, eviction, and land ownership. As you can see, affordable housing seemed to be a very hot topic for folks, which makes a lot of sense considering the fact that housing costs have gone up significantly throughout the state. And by rent burden, we refer to the issue in which folks struggle to pay rent due to rising costs or limited income sources. Development refers to the building and the creation of housing. Specifically, folks brought up the construction of new luxury apartment buildings that further the gentrification of their communities, as well as the immense need to build more affordable low-income housing. And so moving on to the quotes around this issue, we can see the first one is, having affordable housing is one of the biggest issues we have with assisting refugees. If there were more opportunities for emergency housing or places we could offer our clients when they need to find a permanent place or move somewhere they can afford. This really highlights the intersection of housing and immigrant issues, since there are very unique struggles that immigrants face when they're looking for an affordable place to live. The next one being alternative modes of housing together, buying back our community, creating community land trusts, leveraging local low-income tax credits. And this came from a San Diego participant. And as you can see, the last one is housing, Section 8, housing assistance, regardless of immigration status. So all of these quotes really back up the findings that we showed in the previous slide, and also show that affordability was definitely a major concern within the topic of housing. Specifically, participants brought up the importance and the need for more accessible Section 8 vouchers or similar kinds of housing assistance for undocumented individuals at the state level. Currently, undocumented individuals are not eligible for federal public housing or Section 8 programs in California. Dialogue participants specifically mentioned the need for housing assistance programs and policies that undocumented community members can access, especially given the rising costs of housing throughout the state. Our next issue area is the finding of economic inequalities and disparities. So on this slide, we can definitely see that workforce protections and labor standards, as well as wages and workforce development, were some of the key issues that folks discussed. So by workforce protections and labor standards, we refer to any policies or laws that require employers to protect their employees or workforce. So for example, policies created to protect employees from injury, overwork, and abuse. And this can look like safety precaution policies for farm workers that are working during hot summer seasons, or regulations that prevent employers from underpaying their staff, to name a couple of examples. Wages are pretty self-explanatory, but we also included any mention of income sources or additional earnings within this category. And by workforce development, we included mentions of programs and resources that teach vocational skills to workers in order to make them more competitive in the job market and to elevate their earnings and income. All right, so you get the gist of things. Now we're moving on to the quotes. So the first quote is workers' rights, work permits for all, wage equality and safety net, livable wages for all regardless of immigration status. And this came from a Central Valley participant. The next quote being, create a national database of Cal OSHA to see which corporations are repeat offenders violating workers' rights. Statewide database of corporations who are repeatedly violating work rights on safety, health, wage theft, etc. And the last one being workforce development programs for farm workers, i.e. land access, agroecology, training and professional development for social workers to help undocumented immigrants and other professionals, and supporting entrepreneurship among undocumented. So as you can see, the Central Valley especially had many conversations around economic inequalities. And we know that there are very similar concerns in places across the state, such as the Central Coast, for example. These dialogue participants discussed the importance of protecting immigrant farm workers who have to deal with heavy physical labor and long working hours. Particularly vulnerable are undocumented immigrant farm workers who face an even more precarious working situation due to the fear of retaliation of immigration enforcement because of their lack of status. And so relatedly, this leads us into our next finding, which is immigration. All right, so this issue area of immigration refers to conversations that folks had around immigration policies in the US, as well as more local immigration issues like access to funding for immigrant students, for example. Some of the key topics within this issue area were immigration reform or pathway to citizenship, legal representation and deportation defense, detention, and ICE enforcement. Other notable topics included police and ICE collaboration, the California DREAM Act, and the root causes of migration. And so by immigration reform and pathway to citizenship, we refer to conversations that focus on federal legislation that would allow non-citizen immigrants to begin and access the pathway for getting permanent residency and ultimately citizenship status. And the fact that this topic was prevalent throughout all of the dialogues really shows that communities across California are really demanding action from the federal government and Congress on immigration reform, as well as the need for federal leaders and agencies to really prioritize immigration issues. Legal representation refers to immigration attorneys, as well as the legal proceedings that immigrants go through in order to receive their status. And so deportation defense is a very specific type of immigration legal service for folks who are in removal proceedings or have been arrested by ICE or Border Patrol. And lastly, detention refers to immigration detention where people are held in unsafe and restrictive conditions until they are able to acquire legal assistance and remove their deportation order. All right, so for the quotes, these quotes further show the importance of immigration reform, as well as the importance of funding immigrant legal services. So the first one being, stop taking breadcrumbs and really negotiate for equity and reform now, not later. And this was from a Central Valley participant. The next one, stop the deportation and detention of community members, building community power to kick out ICE from working class migrant communities. And the last one, advocating for more permanent funds to support immigration legal services and representation. And so these are once again really highlighting the findings from the previous slide. Our next finding is around the issue area of healthcare. And in regards to healthcare, there were four main topics that folks happened to focus on during the dialogues. There was culturally competent healthcare, mental health, Medi-Cal, and health clinics. As you can see, culturally competent healthcare took up more than a third of the conversations that folks were having. Culturally competent healthcare refers to conversations folks had about healthcare practitioners and support staff being trained and educated on the different cultural backgrounds, languages, and unique needs of patients, as well as offering resources and information in various languages. Mental health refers to anything having to do with the psychological and emotional health of individuals, as well as the resources that are used to better mental health. And Medi-Cal refers to the California state healthcare system for low-income residents, both documented and undocumented. And lastly, health clinics refer to the conversations folks had around the need for better access to doctors and medical care locally. And so for the quotes, here we have some really impactful statements and comments that participants brought up in regards to healthcare. So the first one from San Diego: "We ran into many immigrants where the COVID vaccine was their first time they had access to a form of healthcare. I held the hands of immigrant men who cried after getting a vaccine for the first time. When all the resources due to COVID are gone, these communities will lack access again." And then also from San Diego: "We have people who speak all different languages. Many times these communities are locked out of healthcare because nobody is reaching out to them in their language. For example, Mixteco, Zapoteco, Mayan languages." And the last one from the Central Valley: "Language accessibility is very minimal in state regulatory agencies. Cal OSHA recently hired an interpretation service to help during work hours. Mixteco and indigenous languages have to wait to make those complaints." And so as you can see, language access is a very, very big issue all throughout the state as well. Our next finding will shine some light on some of the factors now that influence organizations' works and goals. So now we're moving away from issue areas. So in this section, this is where we captured the conversations that folks had around some of the factors that have influenced them over both the long-term and short-term goals of their organization, as well as their operation. So for this chart, during the dialogues, obviously folks mentioned a host of different issues that they cared about and ones that affected their communities. But these are some of the ones that they brought up as certain factors that were impacting the work that they do. And we definitely wanted to raise them up here. So some key factors that were discussed were legislation, both at the state and federal level, impact of funding, and the impact of politics, all at the state and federal level as well. Legislation refers to the conversations folks had about the influence that government bodies, such as the state government, federal government, have over their organizations, as well as the laws and policies that influence their work. Funding refers to the conversations folks had around things like funds being given or taken away from organizations, as well as the dichotomies of who receives the most and least funding. Politics refers to the influence of elected officials that are representing communities in the state or country and their changing motives and agendas that they possess. And so for the quotes, the first one says, "Local and state level are hesitant to give funds to undocumented immigrants." And the next one, "Local budget advocacy. Ensure that state level policies take into account regional differences on increased investment in regions in need. Increase local government investment in pro-immigrant policies and programs." So these quotes really show how the factors either encourage or prevent progress by immigrant rights works. And relatedly, our next finding will concern some of the challenges and opportunities that these organizations in the 4 regions face. So part of the dialogues, we definitely included time for folks to fill out the worksheets that we created in order to list some of the challenges and opportunities that their organizations and communities were facing. And so now we're going to highlight some of those things that folks mentioned. So this chart is very information heavy, but it really allows us to see what challenges and opportunities participants mentioned during the convenings and their ranking in relation with one another. So some key challenges and opportunities were legislation, funding, politics, narrative change, and education and training. And so you'll notice that the columns are ranked almost completely the same, which means that people identified a lot of the same challenges as opportunities as well. And as you can see, legislation was the most common challenge and opportunity. The slight differences to the right, the numerical differences, show that some of these factors were perceived as more of a challenge to folks than an opportunity, and vice versa. So an example is politics, which was seen as slightly more of a challenge than an opportunity, while something like affordable housing was seen as slightly more of an opportunity than challenge. So what this finding really highlights, and the reason that we included it here, is it really highlights the fact that a lot of people saw opportunities in the things that they also considered to be challenges, meaning that there was a hopeful dimension to the conversations that were had at the dialogues and a desire to move forward with things like advocacy. And so specifically, as you can see, folks said disinterest across the federal government, lack of political will, racism, political party flexing, historical inertia. And the last one being establishing a state unemployment benefits program for undocumented workers, safety net for all proposal. So as you can see, especially with the last quote, legislation tied with funding were very prevalent throughout many examples that folks talked about, things such as the Safety Net for All campaign, for example. And our last finding was around the various tools for change that community organizations have at their disposal. So for this finding, folks discussed key strategies and tools that their organizations are using to drive their work in order to make change, as well as tools that they feel would be important for their organizations and others to be able to make progressive change. So as you can see, there's a lot. Social services, civic and community engagement, divest and invest models, education and training, and narrative change were the top 4 tools for change that folks mentioned. Things such as building capacity, coalition building, and data and research were also important tools that folks discussed. Participants really highlighted the need for better and more social services, like mutual aid and legal resources for their immigrant communities. Civic engagement refers to the conversations folks had around advocacy to change or implement policies in order to improve community members' lives. The divest and invest model refers to conversations folks had around the systems that either need additional investment or need to be defunded because of the harm they cause communities. So for example, defunding the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees both ICE and Border Patrol, was a common conversation that folks had at the convenings. Education and training refers to conversations folks had around educating their community members on where to access key social services and resources, as well as training these same community members to become leaders and resource guides in their own neighborhoods and communities. So for example, participants mentioned training systems such as the Prometora model in the different regions. So all of these tools for change obviously are used together most of the time, and they all exist in an ecosystem of different strategies that folks can use collaboratively in order to make progressive change. And we definitely wanted to highlight that. So as you can see, there are so many organizations that offer so many great and trusted services at low cost, but at the same time, there's not enough. How do we change this? And the next one, community hearings. We need to listen to their voices directly and uplift their voices to be heard. Include them in these spaces as well. Grassroots leadership development and civic engagement and candidate development. Listen to community needs, identify most affected communities, set up locations to address issues, pass legislation to correct problems. And this came from a Central Coast Dialogue participant. So these statements, once again, highlight how all of these tools can be used together to make a real impact on our communities. And each tool or strategy is really one cog in the larger clock of progressive social change. And we can see that each one is vital and needed in order to make that change happen. And folks were very clear about that during the dialogues. So finally, we wanted to go over some key takeaways that we had from the different dialogues. So the 3 most common issue areas that were brought up across the 4 regions were housing, economic disparities and inequalities, and immigration. Additionally, the dialogues really highlighted the inextricable intersections between all of these issue areas and their impact on the community. Legislation, impact of funding, and impact of politics were some of the most frequently mentioned challenges and opportunities for organization, with something like legislation being slightly more seen as an opportunity, whereas something like funding and politics were both more perceived as a challenge. In regards to immigration issues, immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship, as well as legal representation and deportation defense, were some of the most common sub-issues. And in regards to immigrant communities, dialogue participants repeatedly called out the plights of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated immigrants, as well as asylum seekers and refugees, specifically to call out the injustices and discrimination that these individuals face. So we really hope that this report back was informative and reflective of all the conversations that we had at the Power of Regional Dialogues. We also hope that this data helps continue to spark conversations across the state on how to best support and uplift immigrant communities, as well as serving as a potential tool for organizations and community groups to use in their visioning and work towards progressive social change. So thank you. And I think with that, we'll move on to the Q&A session.
Hi, thank you so much, Shannon, for that interesting presentation. And thank you to everyone in the chat participating and using the Q&A function to share your questions. So I have a couple questions here that were not answered in the chat. One is, how would Food for All fall under the categories that came up during the research? Does that fit within one of the policy categories?
And just to be clear, you said food for all?
Yes. So yeah. Just
So I think off the top of my head, I would definitely say that that falls under quite a few categories. So a lot of what folks talked about when it came to things like social services definitely centered around topics such as food insecurity and just basic economic insecurity in general. So I think when we're looking at the different issue areas that folks discussed, that's something that can fit under economic inequalities and disparities, I think. But I can see that also, because all these issues are so intersectional, you can really make an argument that it can fit in a couple of others as well.
Great. Thank you for the question. The next question here is from Elena. In the slide with the 2 columns referencing opportunities and challenges, is there a particular reason why racial equity was listed in blue?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Is there a particular reason why racial equity was listed in blue, the term racial equity?
I'm sorry, for some reason I'm having trouble listening.
Okay. Yeah. On that slide, is there a particular reason why racial equity was listed in blue?
Oh, in blue. I'm sorry, I wasn't reading your lips properly. So yes, if basically the reason why we highlighted the blue and the red, as you can see the different categorizations, was because that means that that particular topic was seen as more of a challenge or opportunity. So opportunity was listed in blue and challenge was in red. So that's how we were able to distinguish. So that means that racial equity, folks see that as an opportunity, meaning, for example, the conversations folks had around trying to foster more diversity, more campaigns to really stop hate, for example, hate crimes. Those were things that folks discussed in the context of racial equity. So it had more of a positive moving forward kind of note. So that's why we cited it as an opportunity.
Thank you for clarifying that. So just want to encourage folks to continue using the chat and the Q&A to keep sharing these questions. The next one here is from Joe. Based on your findings, as a rough assessment, how was housing ranked within the priorities that participating organizations were solving for? What sort of resource allocation on average do you think was required to meet these needs and challenges?
So in regards to the first part of the question, so as the entity, the Research Institute, we collected all of this data, right? These conversations folks had. The reason housing is up there is because that happened to be the topic that folks were most concerned with during the 4 convenings that we attended. So as we showed you with the different sources of data that we had, for example, Post-it notes, we had note takers that were taking notes as folks were speaking in large and small group discussions. And then we also had the worksheet, right, that we asked folks to fill out. So combining all of that data, we combed through it and we looked and saw what were the common themes, what did folks discuss the most. And so housing was absolutely the #1 issue, which we think is obviously very, very telling. It makes a lot of sense considering the fact that housing is just getting more and more expensive. So in regards to why is that the primary issue that you see in the data, and you know, we're showing you our findings. That's why, because folks just happen to mention it the most throughout all of the data. I hope that answers your question.
Great. And I think there's a second part to the question, which is about resource allocation to meet the needs and challenges around housing. I'm wondering if you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, I think folks definitely had talked a lot. I think you can see, for example, in some of the quotes that were mentioned, really emphasizing the need for governments and the state government and federal government, for example, to create housing assistance for undocumented immigrants, since as of right now, they're not able to get federal public housing and Section 8 vouchers. So I think in terms of like resource allocation, when folks did talk about policy solutions to these issues around housing, a lot of the discussions did center on things like, you know, let's create more programs, let's have an investment from the state government, from the federal government in housing policies and, you know, housing assistance programs in particular, in order to help folks address this need, specifically undocumented immigrants with the need of housing. Yeah, so that's an example that I can think of off the top of my head.
Thank you. And thank you, Joe, for that question. The next question is from an anonymous attendee, and they are asking about whether there was information learned during the surveys about needs specific to Middle Eastern and North African, otherwise known as MENA immigrants. And they noted here that part of their health equity issues stem from being miscategorized as white when it comes to data collection.
Mm-hmm. Right. That is a very important point, and it is one that we did talk about. I do remember a particular conversation at one of the convenings where we actually had a discussion about that. I think I can definitely say that when looking at the data, there were conversations folks did have, particularly around Muslim immigrants and the Muslim communities across California. And this was throughout the different regions. So we definitely did have discussions around how best to address that. Obviously, folks were bringing it up kind of as an issue that their communities continue to face, you know, things such as hate crimes, for example, and discrimination. And so that definitely came up throughout the dialogues. And I think that also just really called for really showing how diverse immigrant communities are, because I think at the state level, at the federal level, obviously there's always this perception of who an immigrant is, right? Where they come from, the country they come from, their religion, et cetera. And we really need to combat that by showing just how diverse, just within one state, you know, even one city and one region, the immigrant communities that we spoke to at the convenings were so diverse. So we did have those conversations, and folks did bring up grievances that their community members continue to face.
Ben, maybe one thing I'll just add real quick, it's coming from an organization that represented the Muslim community for a long while. I think to Shannon's point, and I think to Sarah's point at some point in the chat, one of the issues that the immigrant community often faces is whether the diversity of the community not being amplified, or sometimes the diversity of issues impacting the community. And I think that's what these findings do represent too, right? Unfortunately, in the minds of elected officials, funders, housing might not come off as an immigrant issue, but in a county in like LA, where a third of the population is immigrant and housing is the #1 issue, it's common sense for that housing issue to also be an issue that's impacting the immigrant community. And for me, what that signals is making sure that whether it's service navigators that have the cultural competency, the language competency to engage with the immigrant community are activated. That's one component of it. And the second component, kind of to the question that was asked here, our communities are very sensitive in what kind of information and data they share about themselves. But we have to find a way to balance that so that we can continue to work with our partners at ERI and others. And I think LA County, again, through the work that it's doing through its anti-racist and diversity initiatives, is trying to integrate, anonymize, and aggregate information around immigrants into how it is doing equitable work. And so to that, to the question around health equity, I know there's initiatives in Orange County, again, that are incorporating work on how to better represent MENA communities. And I would encourage participants who are interested in that work to reach out to CIPC so that we can further have these conversations and strategies that might have to be localized at times, and others that can happen at the statewide level.
Right. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, Benjamin. I do have based off one point that Messi mentioned, I think it's really important to elevate. So that was also a really great question, because I think it also really highlights why we are doing these, one reason why we are having these power of dialogues. Because, for example, when state legislatures look at data from the US Census, for example, it doesn't really paint an honest picture of communities across California and the specific needs and very unique needs that folks have. And so these kinds of dialogues where we sit down with folks, we listen to what they say, we take it in, and we create, a presentation like this to show the data back to you all, is really helpful, because that's being elevated, right? So I think that this is a perfect, segue into like why these dialogues are so important, is that particular note is not something that's represented necessarily on something like the US Census, but it was represented throughout our conversation.
And yeah, thank you so much for jumping in, Messi, and kind of expounding on that. It's definitely something that we're continuing to discuss and see, in this movement. The next question here is from Andorina, and they share that they're curious if burnout or secondhand trauma came up among participants during the dialogues. I think this is quite an interesting question.
Absolutely. So our conversations, I would definitely say, focused more so on what their organizations and communities were seeing as issues. However, the folks that were obviously our dialogue participants, the folks that were in the room talking to us, these are folks who are doing the work on the ground. These are organizers, community advocates, attorneys. And I can say, although it's not physically represented, obviously, in this PowerPoint, we did have conversations around just how hard the work is. And you can definitely see a pattern, I think, in all 4 regions of things like burnout, things like, just really at times it being very hard to be hopeful and energized just because of certain things that we're not able to control, for example. So for example, when it came to the immigration finding, we saw that the majority of folks did talk about a pathway to citizenship, right? The conversations were about the fact that the federal government, Congress, needs to do its job and move forward with passing, legislation, amnesty, et cetera, because we continue to see folks on the ground working, right? I mean, community organizations for decades have been trying to accomplish this goal, and they're continuing to work so hard. And I think the fact that there is this inaction and lack of political will from the federal government, something that folks mentioned during the dialogues, really highlights why, we can see this kind of burnout sometimes. And in addition, I think it also relates to the funding, obviously. I think like when we talk about impact of funding, the less funding organizations have, the more strapped for time and employment they have. And so folks are having to do more work, instead of having just a reasonable amount of work and being able to balance their life. So I think that's relevant to quite a few of the different findings that we saw, but that's a really good point.
And so it's very interesting to hear how that came up on an individual level with the participants and also at the organizational level. Very interesting. The next question here is from an anonymous attendee who says, first, thank you for all the rich findings. Based on your research, what policy would you say is feasible to advocate for at this time? I'm aware there may be many. And I guess is a question that a lot of us would want answered, but I want to add there too, like, from the data and the findings, things that emerged that were new, what would you say to advocates in thinking through how to respond, if it's not reflected in our current policy priorities?
Right. Yeah, because definitely we're speaking from what we heard, right, at these different convenings. So like I just mentioned, a very specific policy solution that folks talked about was the fact that was organizing and advocacy for immigration reform. So when we talked about the immigration issue, that was just something that repeatedly came up in the 4 different regions, Central Coast, Central Valley, LA, and San Diego. And so we do know that there are obviously still campaigns, there are still organizations all throughout the country that are trying to really push Congress, that are really trying to push the federal government to give legalization to folks so that folks don't have to worry about certain issues anymore, right? We see how all of these are intersectional, and immigration is an issue in every sphere. You just can't separate it. And so I think that was something that folks did bring up a lot. In terms of particular local policy solutions, folks did bring up quite a few. For example, when we did talk about housing, folks did mention that there needs to be more of an investment in California specifically in things like housing assistance programs for immigrants. So that was a specific policy solution that folks brought up at the different convenings. So that's an example.
Great. I think that's very helpful as someone who does policy work to hear that there are next steps to everything that we're hearing. So I just want to check on time. I think we have about 1 minute left in the Q&A. Can we do one more? I'm seeing head nods. Okay. Last question from an anonymous attendee. Will there be an accompanying report published from the study? And if so, would it expand on these themes identified in the presentation and include policy recommendations that were raised during the dialogues?
So the scope of work that we as ERI and CIPC agreed to and have done at this point is just the PowerPoint. However, I think that this is something that will potentially be shared, or the information will be shared with folks. So even though it's not in the form of a report, it's not going to be in the form of a report, I think still within the presentation itself, that can be a very helpful tool for folks to see the graphs, for example, and to use that when it comes to their internal organization visioning, or when they want to think about like advocacy strategies. So yes, not a report, but the PowerPoint itself.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking all those questions, and for folks in attendance for making this so engaging. It really deepened our conversation. So that being said, I'll hand it back to Sarah to move us on.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you so much, Shannon. That was a lot of information, and you made it easy to follow, and your responses to the questions, I think, were really helpful. And, I think I just want to add that while we, like Shannon said, the scope of this project and this collaboration between CIPC and ERI didn't include taking this to the next level. I think for a number of reasons, including that, I think in order to publish a report, we'd want to have been able to do a lot more research and collected more information and data, including different regions of the state that we didn't get to. And I think a report would have required a level of additional work and rigor that we didn't, that wasn't envisioned, or the capacity for it was not just encompassed within the scope of this work. However, if this inspires any of you, we are always eager to learn from and see what our partners and all of you as our collaborators in this work might come up with and produce. And we want to hear from you all. And in a lot of cases, it's the groups on the ground regionally that actually are best equipped to compile this information, tell the story of what's happening in your regions. And so we'll put the question back out to you. If anyone wants to write a great report, we'd love to read it. All right, so I'm gonna move us along. And I will say, for the agenda for today, we had left time for Q&A, which Ben just facilitated, and then we did leave some time for a discussion as well. in that time, you can continue to raise questions and also share more reflections. We want to actually hear from you. Like, does this resonate? Does, is what you're hearing locally among immigrant communities tracking with this, or is it different? So further questions, there will be time for further questions, and also more reflections and reactions. Just what does this, what comes to mind when you look at this information for you? So before we do that, I'm very, very honored to have some guests with us. We invited a couple people who are close partners of CIPC and work with immigrant communities in the state, and actually were themselves attendees at 2 of the different listening sessions that we held, and wanted to just give them a chance to share a little bit about what engaging in this process was like for them, and also, if there are any next steps or anything meaningful from this information that they've been able to take and move forward. So I'll start by introducing Dow Lore with the Fresno Center. Yes, Dow, it looks like Dow's here. Dow, I'm going to bring you up onto the virtual stage. Please, introduce yourself, share a little bit about yourself and the work that the Fresno Center does. And in a few minutes, we'd love to just hear your reflections on being a part of these regional dialogues.
Thank you, Sarah. I was hoping you didn't pick me first. Because I always like to start that, believe it or not, I'm actually an introvert. But I do talk a lot now. I was going to say good morning, but good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dell, the Fresno Center in Fresno, California, obviously, Central Valley. And, just want to be thankful for being here today to meet all the partners here throughout the states. And, I want to believe that we all have a lot in common. Just a little bit about the Fresno Center. We were established about 32 years ago, going on 32, to serve the refugees that were coming from Southeast Asia after the end of the Vietnam War. So you have a lot of the community, the Khmer, the Hmong, the Lao, the Vietnamese that were fleeing from persecution. And that's what the agency was established for in 1991 to service kind of like everything we do here, right? Social service, education, dealing with problem at school, dealing with problem at work, you name it. If you've been in a nonprofit space long enough, you realize that your job description doesn't tell you everything you do. There's also a fine line saying other duties as assigned. Anyway, I'm just very blessed, thankful for all the partners here for all the contribution. Just seeing these data and work. Me, I'm a data-driven person. Just my background from college is all data. It's all data. So just seeing the data. Now, the question I have for us here is, what is the next step? Because now we know the problems we have in the States. We have evidence, we have data to back it up, saying that these are the issues. Where do we go from here? Who do we talk to? We know that we have partners. I'm pretty sure everybody here has friends and partners at the state level, the federal level. Can we get them to be on our side to allocate money for our goal? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're left or you're right, you're red or blue or black, or whatever you are. We all have some common problems here, and we need to solve it together. Because unless we come together, it's going to be very difficult for anything to happen. Unity is key. And a state as large as California, growing up, I was always told, we're big enough to be our own country. We're so big, but at the same time, we're so many opinions. And if we could compromise somehow, bring all those opinions, all those ideas together and see how can we serve our immigrant community. Because I was an immigrant. I was born in a refugee camp, came here at the age of 2. I grew up, I want to say I'm pretty blessed to be where I'm at today, but at the same time is when you reflect back, and I'm pretty sure all of us here, just listening to my stories earlier about the 9/11, right? We all look back, reflecting back now, it's kind of like, wow, that happened to me, but I didn't know any better. But now that we do, how do we protect our family moving forward, our community, our friends and families? During the whole 2020 pandemic, we have a lot of hate crime against the API community, because of our former president, right? He's making these claims that doesn't have any backup, that at the end of the day, the API community all across the nation is getting attacked just by somebody vocal, making them a target. And I see it here in my community. So we have these data already. Now, what I would like to see, what I would like to happen moving forward is let's not just let these data become an archive where it's kind of, wow, we made the studies, but let's push forward and say that, hey, we have the data. Because I know that if you work with governments, they always want data to back it up. Instead of just saying he say what she say is this is what the community say is backed up by data. It's not what I say. It's not what the nonprofit say, but it's what the community said. So I'll stop there. I could take all the time. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dal. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your story and the work that you do at the Fresno Center, and your perspectives on why collecting this information in this way matters. Next, I'm going to hand it to Vanessa. Vanessa Teran is the policy director at Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project, or MICOP, another organization that does incredible work and with whom CIPC works very closely. And Vanessa is no stranger to all of the different campaigns that CIPC works on. Vanessa, I'll hand it to you if you're ready.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak on a wide range of issues and also to speak to advocates, community leaders, and organizers across the state. My name again is Vanessa Teran. My pronouns are they, them. I have the honor to serve as a policy director to the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project. And just to give you a little bit of information about MICOP, MICOP was established in 2001 to support, organize, and empower the indigenous immigrant community from the Mexican states of Oaxaca, Guerrero, including Puebla. And the primary community and shout out to everybody who's sending some hearts, to the Mixtec community, Zapotec community, Purépecha community. There's 17, 18 different ethnic groups in the state of Oaxaca alone. It's one of the most diverse states in Mexico. And we have some of the most diverse flora and fauna in the world that is being deprived right now due to a lot of environmental racism and the continued extraction of our wealth. And so I also want to share that MICOP is also the only organization entirely dedicated to serve and address the unique needs of indigenous migrants in the California Central Coast, specifically in the counties of Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo. So those three counties, we're more on the Central Coast, think of being next to the ocean and right next to the mountains. And a lot of our partners come from the Valle Central, or the Central Valley, which you got informed about today. What I really want to highlight is that what I appreciate about this report is the way it incorporates many underserved and marginalized voices through the power of collective work. I also want to highlight that the way that we as an organization build our policy, advocacy, and community organizing has been largely informed by the ongoing continual racism, discrimination, and violence that contributes to the health disparities that we face as an indigenous and migrant community. For example, during COVID, we quickly learned that if we waited for our institutions to take action, we were going to die. We were going to have people who were facing such a huge disparity that they didn't have access to healthcare, they didn't have access to vaccines. So in that moment, we really took it into our hands to campaign to save the lives of our immigrant community, our Black and Brown community, our Indigenous community, and to make efforts to connect them to those vaccines and protective equipment that others had quickly had access to, including food such as diapers and milk, to safeguard them when others didn't, right? And for the first time, it was interesting because the state truly saw the power of our identity and language as our primary strength and cultural wealth. And from this, many CBOs that were in the shadows finally received funding from the state. And the money came in after. The money flowed in because they couldn't understand how we could mobilize so quickly. And this was because for us, as a migrant community, as an indigenous community, as a community of color, we understand that self-care requires community support. Health and healing requires us to know our neighbors, to talk to our neighbors, and to speak the same language that they speak. And so with this said, right now in the hot topic or in the rise of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, we see now a statewide opportunity to prioritize, to create laws that support cultural and linguistic competency trainings across all fields, from healthcare to our judicial and educational systems, and particularly in the workforce to advance racial equity and support our underserved communities. I want to share And shout out to my compañero Juvenal, our community organizer here, that last year, AB 2082, authored by Assemblymember Robert Rivas, would have created a farm worker indigenous language outreach program. So for the first time, Cal OSHA would have been required to establish and administer a pilot program to contract with community-based organizations in 3 counties to provide workplace health and safety and outreach services to farm workers in indigenous languages. Still, that law was held in committee without any further action. As you see in these findings, we strongly believe that we have an opportunity to make changes that can impact institutional and systemic challenges, as simply with the power of language, we can generate a new change. And language to us is a fundamental human right that we need to continue to emphasize in policy. And so with that said, I really do think that when we talk about building these policy priorities, they really lay the foundation for future generations to live in a more just world. So I want to close with that and appreciate you all for all your contributions, everybody who's been a part of those conversations. All voices here are critical and valuable, and every perspective is unique. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Your perspective is always appreciated in any space that you're in. We have a little bit of time for a short discussion and any other reflections. I want to give Masi a chance to chime in. I know Masi had thoughts about something that Dao raised, and then I will hand it to Ben to pull out any other questions that might be coming up in the chat or any other quick reflections. And you can share your reflections in the chat as well.
First, Vanessa, thank you for everything that you shared and the work that you continue to do. Dao, I wanted to kind of answer the question of what's next directly, and hopefully elicit excitement amongst the over 100 participants that have been with us here today. I think CIPC, really, we see our role as an amplifier of what folks across the state are seeing, feeling, and we want to make sure that we're sharing information, resources, and strategy. And sometimes that might be statewide strategies on how to do work at the state level, policy or budget advocacy. But sometimes there might be specific strategies that are used in localities that can be again learned from and utilized in other regions. And so we have initiatives like our regional capacity building work that we want to continue to amplify these findings and really work with you all. And so I know the Central Valley has been and will continue to be a priority for us, as well as the Central Coast. And so that's what I'm excited about. And there's opportunities in the Inland Empire and other places, and continuing to learn from our partners down at the border on what the needs are and where resources need to be allocated. So I think this in many ways is just the beginning of that next step. And then you raised another great point around like the AAPI community and the hate that they faced during the Trump years. And there would be times where like organizations like AAPI Equity Alliance are doing great work with the API equity budget and the work that they've done around that. So we won't need to duplicate, right? So we want to amplify and uplift the work that's already being done by others, and then find out where more resources are going to be needed on how CIPC and ERI and others can step in to support.
All right, Ben, I'll hand it back to you for a short additional opportunity for discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. So stay with us, everyone. We're almost done, and we'd love to hear more of your thoughts before we wrap up the event. So yeah, just in the spirit of what Dao and Vanessa shared, we want to take this back to you and ask you all, what are the issues that are of greatest priority in your region with your organization and the communities that you work with? Are they similar to what we mentioned and presented in the findings? Or were they different? And yeah, please share in the chat and just would love to get a chance to hear more on how this is resonating with you all. So I'm seeing Amy shared, sometimes this work is so difficult and seems so futile, but thank you to all of you for giving us hope and the will to continue. Thank you for that. Yeah, we're all together in this. Eliezer shared immigration reform that is inclusive for all. So I'm hearing that has resonated with you. Immigration legal support for youth, especially at the HS level, high school level, I'm assuming. Thank you for Virginia for sharing that. Yeah, and please continue typing them out in the chat. Also, if folks feel brave, feel free to raise your hand and share, and we can unmute you as well. If you'd like to elaborate. Vanessa says, shout out to CBDIO as original co-sponsors of AB 2082, to which we were invited as MyCop co-sponsor and lead as leading organizations, indigenous organizations across the state. And appreciation for all the affirmation. Felicity shares more legal support for post-conviction relief being a priority in their community. Any other thoughts? Great. And one from Ruth. Thank you for uplifting the voices of immigrants across the state and helping to mobilize advocates for action. Thank you for joining us as we do this together. Margaret has shared, language barriers block Haitian migrants from so many resources and participation in events like this. It is more than the language per se. It is communication in a larger sense. Thank you for expanding on that. That's really important. And for uplifting how this is affecting Haitian migrants. Okay, well, I think we're at time. So continue to share in the chat. I think we'd all appreciate hearing everyone's thoughts and making this a really participatory event. That being said, I will hand it back to Beatrice to wrap us up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ben, for guiding our discussion. And for everyone, before you get going, please take a look at the chat box because we have dropped a link to an evaluation form. We really want to hear from all of you and hear what you thought about today's webinar. And so we would really appreciate it if you take a look and click and fill that out for us. Also, please expect an email from us where we will be sharing today's recording. And lastly, we want to invite you all to our next event, which is Immigrant Day of Action, also known as IDA. It is a day where we come together to get loud for immigrants and lobby for just policies that better the lives of families, workers, young adults who are undocumented. So please sign up for our newsletter to know when our Save the Date goes out, because we're still in the planning process, but we want you to already be preparing for that. So please sign up to our newsletter to hear more about that event and other future events so that you can join us for that as well. Well, thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your day y seguimos en la lucha. Hasta luego. Whoever is recording, can you end it?